Some hikers came out of the tree line into Johnson Meadows and began walking across the center of it. And as they're walking along, they notice up ahead what looks like a tent and a campsite. And as they passed by it, they noticed that the campsite was definitely abandoned, and it looked totally destroyed, like a tornado had crossed right across it. So they walked over to this campsite. There's unopened cans of food, there's papers and documents, the tent is in ruins. I mean, the place is just a total mess. But as a precaution, they called the Madera County Sheriff's Office and they reported the site. They would search the campsite and they would find some ID cards, and the name on those ID cards was Sandra Hughes. When Sandra's family heard about the state of Sandra's campsite, they told the sheriffs that Sandra was incredibly environmentally conscious and was very cleanly, and so she would never, ever leave her campsite looking that way on purpose. Something else had to have happened. And so that day, they filed an official missing person report. Over the next 2 days, a massive search was launched in Johnson Meadows and the surrounding area. And during the search, the Madera County Sheriff's Office was interviewing anybody who was out there, hikers, campers, and asking them if they had had any contact with Sandra. But unfortunately, no one had seen Sandra. And despite this massive search effort over these first 2 days, nothing new was discovered that could lead authorities to where she had gone. 2 days into her disappearance, Sandra Hughes was spotted. Some hikers were cutting through the Johnson Meadows area, and they saw this woman who was just standing off to the side of the meadow. She was by herself. She had no gear with her. She was barefoot. She had a black shirt on. She had blue jeans on. She had a bruise on her face, and she was just kind of standing there as if she was waiting for something. And as these hikers walked past her, she didn't wave them down. She didn't act distressed. She didn't look like she needed any help. They just kind of saw this person minding their own business, and they walked right on past her. It wasn't until those hikers got to the parking lot that they saw all these missing person flyers out for Sandra Hughes, and they would see the picture of Sandra and they would see her distinctive blue hair, that they would say, oh my goodness, the barefoot woman we just saw standing in the forest is Sandra Hughes. And so the hikers called the sheriff's office. They headed out to where they had claimed to have seen her, but there was no sign of her, and there was nothing left behind that would indicate where she might have gone. The following day, Sandra's vehicle was located, but Sandra was not with it. It was found 5 miles north of where her destroyed campsite was, and the vehicle was actually at the bottom of a ravine, and this ravine was right next to a winding forest road. Authorities believed Sandra was driving the car on that road and then hit a tree, and then she rolled off the embankment down to the bottom of the ravine. Someone had pulled out all of the things inside of the car and kind of thrown them carelessly all over the forest floor, as if they were kind of rummaging through her car looking for something, throwing things as they went. And the Madera County sheriffs couldn't help but think that this was eerily similar to how her campsite looked in Johnson Meadows. At this point, authorities did not believe Sandra was actively trying to evade them. Instead, they thought, maybe Sandra got hurt and the injury has impaired her cognitive abilities, and so now, maybe she's lost in the woods and doesn't know what's going on. And so a decision was made to just leave her vehicle where it was, thinking, maybe Sandra is going to come back. And so authorities left a note in the window of her vehicle that said, hey, Sandra, we're looking for you. Please call this number if you see this. And then at the bottom of this note, it said, your family really misses you. 1 week after the vehicle was discovered, a team of searchers had made their way 2.5 miles north of the vehicle, and they were actually inside of Yosemite National Park. This is an area that's very difficult to get to. They see a sleeping bag, and it's laying out right in the middle of the ground, in the middle of nowhere, and it would turn out that sleeping bag was Sandra's. But again, there was no sign of Sandra. Authorities were totally baffled. On a map, Johnson Meadows, where her first campsite was, then her vehicle, and then this sleeping bag were all more or less in a straight line going south to north. It was almost like Sandra, from the day she went missing, had just begun slowly working her way to the north, but she was doing it without any equipment and most likely barefoot. Authorities knew if they didn't find her soon, even if she was doing this on purpose, she was likely going to succumb to the elements. The search for Sandra would continue for for another week, but by that time, there hadn't been any new developments, and so unfortunately, the authorities had to scale back their search. About 3 weeks later, two hunters were driving down this very desolate forest road, and as they're driving along, they turn this corner, and as soon as they do, they look up ahead, and they see there's this woman. She's kind of tucked up a ways on this hillside in the trees, and she's leaning up against a tree. She's got no equipment with her. There's no backpack, there's nothing, no tent, and there's no other people anywhere. I mean, they're in a very isolated part of this forest, and it's odd to see people here to begin with. And so they pull up right up alongside her. She's still, 10, 15 feet away from them, tucked up in the trees. They're looking up at her, trying to kind of flag her and get her attention, but the woman is not paying attention to them at all. She just continues to prop herself up against this tree and just kind of stares off into the distance. And so ultimately the hunters thought, okay, well, we don't know what this woman's doing, but it seems like she's here on purpose and she doesn't seem like she's in distress. She doesn't look hurt. And so they just decided to carry on. And so they drove off, and then later that day, they would see one of the missing person flyers for Sandra Hughes, and they saw the blue hair in the picture, and they were like, the woman we saw was that woman, Sandra Hughes. The hunters would contact the Madera County Sheriff's Office and report the sighting, and they would describe Sandra as wearing overalls and a floral t-shirt, which was interesting to sheriffs because the last time Sandra was sighted, she had been wearing a black shirt and blue jeans. And so clearly she had changed her outfit, but that didn't really make any sense because she had left all of her things at the campsite and her car. But regardless, they headed out to that road where the hunters had seen Sandra, but like always, Sandra was not there and there was no sign she had ever been there. After this, Sandra's case went cold, and so authorities and her family began to brace for the reality that they likely would never see her again. But there was one more terrifying twist coming. A year later, on Wednesday, July 21st, 2021, Jake Gorba, his wife Victoria, and their 3 young children were driving on their way to the top of Shut-Eye Peak, located about 5 miles to the south of where Sandra's first campsite was discovered. The kids in the back start complaining that they're hungry. And so Jake and Victoria, they decide, you know what, let's just pull over and we'll have a quick lunch. And as luck would have it, the road they were on would actually level off and lead them to this kind of short, flat section of the mountain. And so Jake and his wife thought this is a great place to stop and have a little picnic. And then as Jake and his wife are kind of gathering up their things, they hear their 3-year-old son named Caden, who's in the back seat, start talking. He was turned and looking out his open window, looking across this small meadow into the forest, engaged in some sort of intense conversation with somebody outside. And so Jake and Victoria, they don't see anyone. And so Victoria, she looks at her son and goes, Caden, who are you talking to? And what he would say to her would send goosebumps all over her body. And in fact, what would happen over the next several minutes from that point onward was so unsettling that Jake and Victoria decided, you know what? We're not going to the top of Shut-Eye Peak. We're turning around and we're leaving. And so they would speed out of the forest and they would get back home. And that night, Victoria would make a Facebook post about what her son said and this terrifying ordeal they experienced. And that night, the Madera County Sheriff's Office would reach out to Victoria via a Facebook message, and they would tell her, hey, we saw your post. Can we please speak to you and your son? And after speaking with Caden and hearing what he had to say, they would leave that exchange just as unsettled as Caden's parents. The day before, when Victoria turned around and looked at Caden and said, who are you talking to? Caden would turn away from the window and look at his mom, and he would say, there's a woman out there and she needs our help. And he starts pointing out the window. And so again, Jake and Victoria, they look from their son back out the window and they don't see anyone. And so they turn back to Caden and they say, honey, we don't see anyone out there. And Caden, at this point, he becomes emphatic and he says, Mom, you gotta trust me. She's right there. She needs our help. She's lying face down. Her legs are straight up and she's dead. Jake promptly hops out of the car and just starts running into the woods to see what's going on. Is there a person out here? But he's out there looking around and there's no one. And while he's out there, his son is pointing in the direction of where he is, claiming there's this woman right near him. And so Jake's looking around thinking, There's no one out here. I have no idea what my son's on about. And so he's spooked. He runs back to the car. And when he gets inside, Caden is still looking out the window. He's pointing and he's talking to this dead woman that needs their help. And so Jake and Victoria, they were horrified. They turned around, they left. And then that night, when Victoria made that Facebook post, she included in the post what this woman apparently looked like based on what Caden said. And what Caden said was she had a black t-shirt on, blue jeans on, and blue hair. And so when the Madera County Sheriff's Office saw this post that described seeing a person in a black shirt, blue jeans, and blue hair, they knew that description matched Sandra Hughes. And so when the sheriffs met up with the Gorba family, they brought with them a lineup of several women, and they went right up to Caden, and without giving him any extra information, they just showed him all these pictures of all these women. And they said, Caden, can you identify in any of these pictures the woman you saw in the woods? And Caden looks at these pictures and he picks out 3 pictures. All 3 are Sandra Hughes. The sheriffs, along with Caden and his father, they would return to that section of Shut Eye Peak, but like always, there was nothing. As of today, we still have no idea where Sandra is or what happened to her, and nobody has any idea what to make of the very strange sightings of her that occurred after she went missing. It's all just one big mystery. If anyone has any information about Sandra Hughes, you are encouraged to contact the Madera County Sheriff's Office. Just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.